Hey everyone, and welcome to another Drastic Measures Islam live stream. I have with me tonight a special guest. It's Rob, and he's the owner of the Speakers Corner UK YouTube channel. He's also the former co-host of the Islamic discussion channel, the Gin and Tonic Show, and he's currently one of the heavyweights debating on Clubhouse. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Good evening, Drastic. Good evening, everybody. It's fascinating and good to be back on a StreamYard live stream. So I haven't done that for quite some while. I wouldn't say I don't know if I'd say I'm a heavyweight. There's certainly people that are more heavyweight than me, even on Gin and Tonic, on Clubhouse and one particular guy, and I can talk about that a bit later, that I think is like super good, like way better than me. And that's the sort of guy I would say is probably the heavyweight on Clubhouse. But I know a little bit more than most of the atheists on Islam, because of course I've been involved in that for longer. So
yeah, for those who are not familiar with Rob, he is a very humble guy, and he'll often kind of play down his own sort of skills and background, but he's been doing kind of religious discussions now for a very long time. Rob, you before you became co-host of the Gin and Tonic Show, you were down at Speakers Corner, and you were kind of an established presence there for a while before you joined. Maybe could you give us a rundown of how that got started, how you found out about Speakers Corner, and when you started going down there?
Yeah, sure. It was kind of by mistake, almost, in a sense. I was doing some work in London, and I happened to be working on a Sunday, and at a break time, I sort of took a wander down there because I was working close to Speakers Corner some years back, probably around 2016, 17, somewhere around there, I think. I'd have to look at my channel to see kind of when the first videos. I didn't start recording until sometime later on, but I went down there on a Sunday afternoon during a lunch hour, and just was, sort of fascinated by all these people standing around talking about these things. And I think there's still a video of me. I don't know if it was the first time. It may have been that first time I went down there. I think there's still a video on the channel. I'd have to look it up, of my very first encounter with a Muslim in Speakers Corner. And he was a particularly, let's just say, not a particularly experienced Muslim Dawah person. And you can see the video of me talking to him. And then he calls over a guy called Mansour, who's a much more experienced Dawah propagandist in Speakers Corner. And he asked a few questions, but I was completely raw. I mean, I was clueless, really, but I was hugely dubious of, these ideas and so forth. And that sort of, the bug sort of bit me. And from then I decided to go down regularly. I used to, because I lived in a bigger London area, so it used to take me about an hour or something to get to Speakers Corner, and I would pop in many Sundays, two or three sometimes a month. So there'd be a rare occasion when I wasn't there, and I'd sort of get there like lunchtime, 1 o'clock, and sometimes, depending on the time of day and whether it was raining or not and how many people were there, I could stay as late as 8 o'clock in the evening, or even sometimes a bit later, because I could get a train home and it wasn't a problem. And that's kind of where it started, really.
Yeah, well, to confirm on the dates, I can't tell you exactly when you were starting there, but I have had a look at your YouTube channel, and there seemed to be the early uploads was probably around June, July time of 2016. So I don't know if that...
Wow, okay, it is 2016. So then I would have gone there earlier in 2016, because I didn't start recording myself for a few months at the very least. I sort of went down there and I would just walk around and chat to people and listen in, especially in the beginning, because, you get used to it. And that would be my advice. If you are ever in London and you're interested, go down on a Sunday to Speakers Corner. It's near Marble Arch, Hyde Park Corner. Go and listen in. Now, if you've had some interactions online, or you're a bit more familiar with discussions or Islam or even Christianity, then of course you could engage. But in the beginning, I was sort of listening, and if somebody spoke to me, I would speak back. And especially if you're a new face there, in particular, it's dominated mostly by Muslims, and if they see a new face and you're willing to speak, then they love that, right? Because here's a new person that they could speak to, that maybe they can do dawah with. So I didn't know it was 2016 actually, but yeah, it's been quite a while. So
yeah, well, as I say, I mean, I thought it was important to point it out, because it just shows how many years of experience you have at this now. And I remember when you first joined the Gin and Tonic Show, you were, so without sounding disrespectful, a little bit green on the topic still. You were kind of still finding your way with all the apologetics and things like that. And fortunately, you had Stop Spam in there, who's got possibly more knowledge on Islam than most atheists I've ever met. Yeah, you to talk about the Muslim presence at Speaker's Corner. As far as I know now, it's probably 90% Muslim down there. Was it the same when you were going down there in those early years?
Probably about the same. When we say early years for me, I actually missed other people that went down there. And one of the Clubhouse heavyweights, which we can always come back to, he was actually in Speaker's Corner, and he stopped going in 2016. So either we might have even missed each other, or I wouldn't even have known who he was. And we might have just missed each other. But in those days, it was pretty much the same. The cameras weren't quite as many and as regular as they were in a few years later on, towards the end of the 2010s or the 2000s, I guess you'd call it, or 2010s, towards 2020, or after, I would say 2018, 19, it probably picked up a lot more. There'd be live streams, there'd be a lot of cameras. And maybe there were more Muslims. It's hard to judge really at that stage, but certainly they were the majority down there virtually every Sunday, because, of course, there is a Muslim community not that far from Speaker's Corner itself. So it doesn't take them far to come. And as it grew and as it became more popular online, because there were cameras that were live streaming or recording, and they were doing, their propaganda channels, that sort of was a big advertisement. So anybody either that was a visitor to the UK or indeed was interested in the topic, got to hear about Speaker's Corner and came down. So it's hard to tell how many more there were. And I haven't been there now to see how much more. It sounds like you might have gone more recently, and maybe it's become even more Muslim, interlocutors there than what I was encountering when I was there.
I've not been down there personally, but I've seen from other people that have, saying that the Muslim presence is now really dominant, more than it's ever been, and they're even doing things like praying in the park, which I thought was technically illegal, but apparently that business has started up again. But it's funny because when you were first going down there, the likes of some of the very famous star apologists we know now, Ali Dawah, Muhammad Hijab, I wouldn't say they were unknown at that time, but they were kind of getting started and or becoming sort of into their early fame, if you like, or infamy. And I remember there was several videos with you where it seemed to be more friendly, like you were shaking hands and everyone, there almost seemed to be a bit more of a friendly vibe, whereas in later years a certain hostility crept in and intimidation tactics and that kind of thing. Do you remember kind of having a reasonable, friendly relationship with Muslims down there at the time when you first started, or was it always a bit hostile?
I never went in with hostility, and there wasn't generally too much hostility towards me. I went there to have the discussions about it. I wasn't particularly there to rile Muslims up or to insult people or whatever. If they chose to feel insulted, that's up to them. But it wasn't my intention to go down there and do that. My intention was to go and discuss it, to learn, to offer my critiques. And as I became more familiar with it, obviously I became a more, known face, for want of a better word. And so, there were the odd occasions where somebody was somewhat hostile, but I never had any real threats of, violence or whatever the case was. Occasionally, like I say, you'd have sort of a back and forth with somebody, and I certainly wasn't. I'm not sort of somebody who will back down, but I'm also not somebody who would want to bully or who would want to take advantage of somebody that I thought was kind of, for want of a better word, low-hanging fruit. So that was never my intention. I would rather prefer to have the discussion with somebody that's articulate and, decent interlocutor, as I do now. I actually prefer, and I always have really preferred that sort of thing. And I actually did at one stage. I do remember having dinner with some of the regulars there. So people like Hashim and Mansour and some of those guys. And I think even Ali Dawah perhaps at one time. Literally, we went up the road in Edgware Road, which is one of the main roads, not far, literally a short walk from Speaker's Corner, and I had dinner with them. Very different away from the corner, apart from Mansur, who still wanted to kind of do the Dawah type thing, which I was actually okay with, because that's what I would do there, and I'd do that if they were open to it. But when we sat down to have dinner, very different. It became much more jovial. It was more like casual. And so, there was this transition from, here I'm this sort of Dawah guy putting on, in a sense, I'm not saying they did it on purpose, but they had this Dawah, a presence in the corner. And then when I had this dinner with them the one time, they were just like regular people, right? Had I not known they were Muslim or recognized them from the corner, they would have just been like regular people. So there was this, at least to me, noticeable with a number of them being very different away from the corner, which was interesting to me.
A kind of showmanship, almost, you might say, then, once they're in front of the camera.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to characterize it necessarily. I mean, you could see it that way. I don't know their intention, so I can't say, hey, they're just putting this on. I would take people to believe what they say they believe until I've got evidence that they don't, for example, that they behave one way here and a different way there. But there was just this noticeable difference on that particular occasion of being sort of more friendly. There was very little talk, apart from Mansur himself, of any of the sort of Dawah stuff. And that what did surprise me, because I did think that we'd sort of continue it in a more, calm manner, because there's no cameras there and so forth. And you're right, maybe, and I think that does happen. And that's what I noticed over time, that particularly the kind of well-known regular faces there became a presence as their channels grew. A little bit of the ego grew along with that. And so they wanted to, come across to their audience as somebody that was knowledgeable, that wouldn't, quote unquote, lose a debate, whatever that's supposed to mean. And so I think the egos have grown over time, and the bigger the channels, the more you've got to lose. And so that sort of stuff, unfortunately, has probably grown more. And that became sort of a focus for me after a while, of recognizing, because once I'd heard most of the arguments, every now and again there would be something new. So I certainly don't know it all now either. But I got to a point where most of the regular arguments I'd known, I'd spoken about, I'd had a look at or looked up or whatever the case was. And then it became more of a focus for me of understanding, what do these people do in an interaction, right? And I started to focus more on what I'd consider the debate tactics. What happens when they can't answer something? What happens in terms of it being a back and forth and stuff? And I noticed various patterns. And that's helped me over time to recognize when that happens, because I still speak to people now, but it's mostly online, because I've moved a long way away from there, so I don't go there anymore, unfortunately. I'd like to pop down there again, but I think being online now, there is a higher quality of person on the line, and that's to be expected. It's a much smaller number of people there, and it's very rare that you have somebody like a high quality interlocutor, somebody that's knowledgeable, that's intellectually honest, that doesn't use debate tactics and knows their topic, that can really do that. And there are a few, a couple of Muslims perhaps, and certainly a couple of Christians, but it is a rarity. But online you get a lot, higher quality compared to Speaker's Corner, just because you've got a larger pool of people, I guess.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about when you joined the Gin and Tonic Show. The first episode that you showed up was on the 16th of October. I know this partly because I'm a bit of a geek, but also because I've been going through the archive, and I'm going to be putting out some of your best moments over the coming months, yours and Stops from your era. But when you joined, it was a strange coincidence, because it was the weekend of the 5th anniversary of the Gin and Tonic Show, and it was also the 200th episode. So it was, funnily enough, I would almost think if we were of suspicious mind, we might think it was kind of providence, because I think at the time, Stop Spamming had been kind of carrying the show on his shoulders as a sole kind of host for about a year and a half, and I think he was flagging somewhat. I hope he doesn't mind me saying that. I think he was experiencing understandable burnout, and when you came along, I think it injected a freshness into the show, and I think even Stops was quickly revitalized. How did it, listening to that episode, it seemed like it was almost maybe not your first conversation together, but you hadn't had that much talking time, maybe. Do you sort of remember first talking to Stops, and was it on that show, or had you previously had a chat with him?
Do you know, I don't actually remember. Do you remember the date? You did say October. What year was that? Do you remember?
16th of October, 2016.
Oh, right, 2016. I don't remember if I'd spoken to him before. I'd heard the Gin and Tonic Show before, and I must have gone on as a guest. My memory's not as it once was in terms of the specifics of it. I'd have to go back and listen again and probably,
Well, as
cringe
I
a
say,
little bit at my...
that show was the first time you'd actually called in and you were on the show on that day. You called in towards the end of the episode and you were kind of saying hello, and I think Stops was kind of saying, you should come onto the show again, and so that's why it almost sounded like it was the first time you guys had spoken. But I think he'd watched your YouTube channel and seen some of your conversations. So I think that's
so it might well have been the first time. It's hard to remember. But Stops was a great host, and we just got on so well, and we still keep in contact, although it's not that regular anymore. But it would be nice to do, I guess, an anniversary show again. And we just hit it off. Sometimes I think you just gel with somebody, and he had like many strengths, and maybe I just brought a different perspective from Speaker's Corner, and I think the two of us just worked really well together. And it was great to have other guests and stuff like that. And I know that things changed for him, so I took it over for a while. And I think that was really good. You can do it on your own. I'm not somebody who can talk nonstop on my own. And believe me, I find people on these other platforms who could run a show all by themselves. They just never stop talking. But I need somebody to interact with, to bounce off ideas and so forth. So I'd very rarely ever be a host on my own. I could, but I'd find it kind of tedious. I think it's nice, like you and I speaking now and that sort of thing. And he and I really did hit it off. And, I do look back on that with fond memories of, doing those shows with him for the most part. There were occasions where it kind of got a little bit tedious towards the end, but he specifically made it so good that the two of us were there together. So I think, all credit to him. It was great.
Do you think your South African connection had anything to do with it?
I think it did. There's probably is a little bit of, here's a fellow South African, or at least he had South African accent. He's obviously lived other places as well. But that probably, can't lie, that could have played into it as well. I think there's not that many South Africans that talk about these topics, at least not that I'm aware of. There probably are. I'm just not aware of too many fellow South Africans. So that might well have had an influence. But I think it's also about the personality and the way somebody comes across, and the way we can just do it kind of very smoothly together. And I think as you could see the show progress, we kind of got to know each other really well, and we would be able to do things, and just it became very easy, very smooth to do it. And that I think was a facet of that, and had we had like 100, 200,000, subscriber shows where we could have 1,000 people on or whatever, I think those shows could have been extremely good, and if there were a way in the future where we could present to a bigger audience, and, challenge Islam, and particularly the sort of, defenders of it, I would certainly be open to looking at that again, especially with himself. And I would try and pull in this guy from Clubhouse. I think the three of us would be really, really good, because I think the one thing that we lacked, I did a little bit of it. Stops, that wasn't his sort of wheelhouse, is more the sort of philosophy and so forth. He was super good and knowledgeable on Islam and all the claims, and he'd looked them all up. And, he's just a wealth of information, like a living library in a sense, which was amazing. I learned so much with him. But the one thing that we could have been even better at would have been sort of the philosophy, the arguments, the reasoning. I've become a little bit better at that. Again, not an expert by any stretch, but this particular guy I know on Clubhouse is really good at that. Probably one of the best I've ever spoken to or interacted with, and I've got to know over a bit of time as well. And I think the three of us would be, very, very good. I could almost step back, because you've got sort of Stops with all that. You've got him with the philosophy. I can come in and, just add some of the rhetoric and just, some of the smooth things. But I think that would have been, but I'd want to, if we ever did something again, I think I'd want to have more viewers. I'd want to do it in a way where you can get out to more people. And that, of course, as you do with your channel, it takes time to build a channel. So another way, of course, is to go on an already established channel and be regulars or something like that. That could be of interest,
Well, Rob, if by some miracle my channel actually manages to grow to that size, you would certainly be welcome, and so would Stops. I think it would be great to. And who is this other gentleman that you're talking about? Did you want to say his name, the gentleman?
Yeah, well, he goes with a moniker called Venus,
Yes, yeah, I know
You've
him.
probably heard of him. Well, a couple of people have. I mean, because when I was doing Gin and Tonic, I also in the background did a little bit on a Discord. So there was first a time when I was so obviously as we've gone through, and I know you haven't gone through all of it. I'll briefly do it. We can always come back to it. But I did the Speaker's Corner thing, and then I got onto Gin and Tonic, and I was still at Speaker's Corner on a Sunday and doing the Gin and Tonic, and we did it originally on a Sunday. I think it was a Sunday evening, so I had to get back in time for that. Then we changed the dates to a different day of the week, which means I could stay later at Speaker's Corner and still do a full Gin and Tonic show and not miss it. And of course, when I became host, we chose a particular time and day that worked for all of us and still allowed that. And then, of course, I moved away from Speaker's Corner, or more so moved away from London, a long way away. So, to get into London would take like 4 or 5 hours. So it wasn't really realistic. I did it once or twice. It cost me a fortune, and I could only be there for like 5 hours and then I had to leave. And so it really wasn't worth it. And it cost, as I say, quite a bit of money to get there and back, because driving wasn't really an option. At that stage, I became Gin and Tonic only. And I sort of got onto Discord and found some of the, let's call it the God Talk type of community, and I hang out there, and I was on different servers there, and then over the last year and a half, I guess, I found my way onto Clubhouse, and there's a smaller community there of regulars, and you can, the way the platform works, it's just easy for people who want to speak to each other to come together and open a room, which is kind of like like StreamYard, but you can see people in there, and I would encourage people to go on Clubhouse. You definitely find me there. I'm still on there quite regularly. But then I moved away from the live thing in Speaker's Corner. So Venus himself is on there. He's very good at philosophy. He's got a degree in it. He's also very knowledgeable in Islam, more than me. He's very good at stops. He's better than stops in a couple of areas. Stops knows more in other areas. So the complement there, I think, would be really good. And he's a super sharp reasoner. And he's got the arguments. I actually use one of them now that I think makes it the case that God is impossible. Not just that I believe God doesn't exist. I make a much stronger claim now than I used to, thanks to his argument, listening to him, and then presenting it to, probably at least 50 people now, hearing their responses and so forth. And I think what's been really good for me is to be around people, like it was with Stops, around people now that are smarter than me. You learn a lot from doing that, because I don't study the books and so forth or read up a lot online. I tend to pick it up from smart people because I enjoy listening to them and so forth. And so, like I say, if we had Venus in our corner, he's a heavyweight in my view. And I don't say that about many people. Having had, looking back now, probably 7 years experience, give or take, or a bit more than that now, I can quite quickly tell where somebody's line of expertise is or not, as the case may be. And I've been exposed to that sort of stuff quite a bit.
It does sound like a bit of a dream team then. So if that can happen in the future, I'm sure a lot of people would enjoy listening. We've kind of shot ahead kind of to what you're doing now, which is absolutely fine. But I'm going to swing back to when you started the Gin and Tonic Show. It was about 2 months after you first appeared. It was in kind of mid-December that you actually took over hosting duties, and then it was you and Stotts were co-hosting for nearly 5 years. What I liked, I mean, you've already touched on it in terms of your partnership and the way you and Stotts work together, and I thought it was really good because Stotts, I think, is always, as well as his great knowledge, he's always had a very irreverent kind of humor, which I've always enjoyed. And I thought that worked well because you were very much more kind of like direct, down to the line, let's be disciplined and kind of ask this point, let's deconstruct this video. And I thought it was almost, I don't want to say like a comedy act, but the way you bounce off each other, like you were kind of opposite in that way, which just worked beautifully on the show, I thought. And although you didn't have his level of knowledge of Islam at the time, you were very much into the philosophical side and deconstructing things in a really careful way. And it touches on a couple of, I'd say, innovations that happened under your stewardship. Number one, you started doing a lot of reviews of various Dawah videos, going in great detail, which I thought was really good because that hadn't really been done that much before you came along. And I think the other thing was really bringing focus on Speaker's Corner. In fact, there were several times that you actually did live streams from Speaker's Corner as Gin and Tonic shows, which I thought were really good. And you there was, and I will be putting up some of these as well, because you had several conversations with the likes of Ali Dawah and Mohammed Hijab. So technically they did appear on the Gin and Tonic show, but they were doing it as part of this live stream. And even though you were still relatively new to it, I felt that you handled them really well. And again, I know you don't like to use the terminology of win or lose a debate, and I understand why, but I felt that you, even with your limited knowledge of Islam at the time, you managed to deconstruct their arguments and kind of make them look not stupid, but kind of well, you took their arguments apart in a very methodical way, which I thought was good. Do you remember having those interactions? Well, first of all, do you remember doing the live streams as the show, as the Gin and Tonic show?
Well, a couple of, there was two things. I'm not sure if you're referring to me literally being in Speaker's Corner and going live there.
Yeah, I am.
I had the video camera. That was separate from the Gin and Tonic show. So the Gin and Tonic show was at the time when I sort of did it, I took over, or we changed the dates, was on a Friday, and that allowed me to go on a Sunday to Speaker's Corner, and then I would live stream, use a little camera live stream. And there were a couple of times actually on those live streams where Stops was listening. Because there's a delay, I had my phone in my pocket, my camera running, and that was streaming to YouTube. But because YouTube is like 30 to 40 seconds behind what's going live, Stops needed to hear what was going on at the time. So I would have him listening in my ear and talking to me on occasions, and we'd chat in the background and stuff like that. So that only happened towards the latter end of the Speaker's Corner thing, where I had him like literally live in my ear. So not live on YouTube, because it would have been too late behind the time.
Yeah, I think you uploaded it kind of as an episode of the Gin and Tonic show.
If you did, I actually didn't remember doing that, so that's interesting. Because I had the Speaker's Corner channel, and that was separate. That had the live streams. That had most of the reviews of debates or whatever the case is, and then Gin and Tonic was typically the show. But it could well have been, there were so many shows that we did, but it could well have been one or two of the shows where we actually either brought up the live. So I wouldn't have been doing it live that I can remember from Speaker's Corner and being on the Gin and Tonic, but I could well have used one of those videos and then done a review live on Gin and Tonic once or twice. But I don't remember us doing it that often on Gin and Tonic.
There were, I can remember having gone through the archive. There was at least two times that I can recall that it was actually, I think one was actually possibly done live on the show, and one, I think it was you recorded it live and then kind of uploaded it for that evening as that kind of Gin and Tonic episode, which I thought was great because it was something new, it was something fresh for the show. It gave everybody who's never had a chance to go down to Speaker's Corner what it's like. I think there was one time it went on for 5 hours, so you really put a long shift in there. It's quite impressive. I don't think I would have had the willpower to have argued with that many people in an afternoon. And you can see the sun gradually going down in the video. That's how long you were there. So.
Yeah, I mean, I got to a point where every now and again I'd have to pop across the road to go to the toilet, and I'd take water with me and try and keep myself hydrated and stuff. But you kind of, when you're in the thick of it, it's like when you're having discussions, your body, it's almost like when you sleep, if you've had a drink, you don't need to necessarily pee for a number of hours. It was the same with that. Once you're in it, it's almost like time stands still. You don't have a perception of time, and also you don't feel in the moment that you need to go away. So I got to the point where I could stay there and have discussions for a number of hours non-stop. And so it became easier, and that meant I didn't have to cut the live stream and so forth, because obviously I'm not going to live stream and walk across, go to a public toilet or whatever the case, live stream. So I'd say to people, I'll be back later on and live stream again. I think if I went back there now, I'd probably live stream again, because I think that's kind of helpful. But that was good in a sense that it brought people on. I didn't always get to watch it though, and sometimes I think it's good if you can interact with the people on, that are viewing online. But because if I'm focused on having a discussion, then my focus is on my interlocutor or interlocutors, if there's more than one, and not so much on the live stream. But I became better at it. Improved the equipment, the sound. I think the key thing with live streaming or any videos down there is your sound. Even if the video doesn't look so good or the sun's going down, as long as you can hear somebody clearly, I think that's the important part of it. And I did sort of enjoy doing the live streams and the videos and so forth, and that sort of got the channel going. When you look back at it,
I'm going to be a bit of a nerd now and just give you some statistics, because you may not realize just how hard you were working. You were joint hosts for 4 years and 7 months, and would you like to take a stab at a guess of how many episodes you did in that time?
I would guess. Probably going to be a bit on the high side. I'd probably guess around 200, but that might be a bit on the high side.
No, it was 234. Okay. 234 episodes in 4 years and 7 months. And bearing in mind, that included a hiatus of 3 months. So really it was 4 years and 4 months, if you want to be really pedantic about it. But and here's another key stat. In 2017 alone, in that one calendar year, you did 64 episodes of the show. Now, for a weekly show, you managed to do 64. I think that's pretty damn impressive.
Yeah, we obviously did at least two a week for a couple of weeks, and obviously then. So that's.
Well, it was over the summer. Over the summer, you seem to be pretty much doing 2 a week, and many of these episodes were running 3, 4, 5 hours as well. And I know you did lots of after show chats and everything else. So I would say that makes you the hardest working partnership in terms of a religious discussion show ever on YouTube. I would.
I wish we had got the viewing numbers. That would have been great. I think that's the sort of thing that not only did it become sort of we needed to do something different. It was a part-time thing that Stops and I kind of enjoyed doing. But unless you do a bit of prep, which I know that the guys that now do it, are really good at, that's where they're better than us. If you don't do that, then you can rely on your knowledge, your interactions and so forth. But at some point, when you've kind of felt like you've done it all, then you do need to reinvent it. And that's one thing that, we kind of got to a point where that became really hard to do. But I think just in general, we were able to carry the show through hopefully some of our, our personality and also Stops' knowledge. And, I became kind of quite good at because I'd done such a lot in Speaker's Corner and, continue to do now. Even though I'm not a philosophical expert, I won't be able to run you through everything. I can kind of spot when people are running tactics or they're making sort of mistakes in reasoning or whatever the case is. And I think now, and even on the show, I was able to kind of break it down and make it sort of understandable to anybody who was, I think, listening without getting technical or trying to make somebody look foolish or whatever the case is, just deconstructing it. And I think that it's like anything, right? The more you practice, the better you kind of get at doing these sort of things. And just a quick thing, because I am sort of see the chat in the background there. Nikhil is obviously one of the new hosts, and I'm so glad that he and the other guys are hosting. And he did ask this. I'll just respond to him in live here. Is there a way we can work with Venus or get his contact? Nikhil, either if you drop me a message in Discord or you drop a drastic message, he'll get it to me. We could try and work something out with Venus. He's very kind of all over the show. He's a bit erratic, so it's hard to pin him down. But if I say, do you want to go on the Gin and Tonic with the current host, they'd love to chat to you. He might well be up for doing that. So if you go via Drastic, or if you get hold of me, or if you join Clubhouse and you look for Rob Speakers with this icon and this name, and you follow me and send me a message, I'll pick that up and I can respond to you there, because that's where he and I hang out. So it's probably easiest to catch me there or go through Drastic. So just a side tangent there for a moment.
No, that's fine. And if you want to respond to any of the comments, or actually, this would be a good point to say, if anybody has any questions that they want to ask Rob, then please feel free to stick them in the chat and we can read them out and Rob can answer them. But, be clean, be nice with your questions. I wanted to point to another thing that really ramped up, and it was really impressive when I went back through the archive, was just how many guests you managed to get on the show. So what I'm going to do is, because I obviously understand with that many episodes, you probably forgotten, you know, a good deal of it. But
yeah, I think I have, to be honest.
I'm going to read you a list of the guests which you managed to get on, and most of these were just in the first couple of years as well. So you had what was one of the last interviews with the Masked Arab. You had Apostate Prophet come on. Harris Sultan made 5 appearances. Abdullah Samir came on 3 times, and you also went on his channel, which is, it's almost like a fourth appearance, because it was you and Stops were talking on his channel. So essentially 4 times with Abdullah Samir, the friendly ex-Muslim. You had Ozymandias II, really, really good philosopher guy. He was on twice. Skydive Phil, excellent kind of science journalist, as he likes to call himself. Vidu Viz, who was, well known. He came on 3 times. You had Armin Navabi from Secular Jihadists. You had Bill Warner, Essence of Thought, who at the time was a big kind of counter Dawah video maker. You even Hassan Radwan, you managed to get him to come out of the semi-retirement for 2 appearances. And this is not including a host of other people who were kind of known names at the at Speaker's Corner, like Sarah and Kalam over Kemet. It was just literally like, it was a guest. It was almost every 2-3 weeks you had a known name coming onto the show. And when I was looking back, I was thinking, how the hell did you manage to get all these people on, Rob? I mean, are you just really charming or what?
Well, it's excuse me. I actually don't remember how I got them on. I think I contacted them, appointed them to the show, and they sort of saw, that we were kind of, semi-serious about doing the critiques, and we were doing it in a way, hopefully, that wasn't disrespectful or whatever. It was more like, not like I would say an academic critique necessarily, but, as lay people, a reasonable level of critique. And I think just listening to those names again, virtually all of those people, amazing to have on. I'd love to know where they all are now and so forth. And that really worked well. I mean, just some of the names pop out to me. Skydive Phil, still a personal friend of mine. We keep in contact once in a while. Obviously, I've moved away there now. In terms of science and in particular cosmology, he's your go-to man. The videos he's produced now are just incredible. If you are not subscribed to Skydive Phil's channel, it's criminal. I should be coming to arrest you.
Rob, I was actually lucky enough to host him for.
I actually saw I saw that one. I saw your. It just happened because I didn't see your channel for a while, and then it popped up in my feed. And I think the one that I did listen to most of it was the Skydive Phil one, which was amazing because you had a long, hours-long conversation, or however long it was.
Yeah, it was
super nice guy, super knowledgeable. Just a wealth of knowledge. And as a person who's not a professional, he's also very, very humble about these sort of things. But when you hear him speak, as a lay person, is what he wants to call himself, he's way above everybody else. And that's how I heard about him. Interesting story with him. I watched I used to be an avid watcher of the videos. Not only did I go to Speaker's Corner, but I'd watch videos. I was subscribed to many of the Muslim channels and so forth, and I'd go and watch videos that were of interest. And I happened to see him speaking to, I think it was one of the EF Dawah guys. I can't remember, Abbas. I think it was Abbas. And I just heard him speak. And after 5 minutes, I went, this guy's like an expert. The way he's talking about the cosmological models and so forth. And Abbas, of course, had no real clue about it, like most people don't. So it's not really, I'm not taking a jab at him specifically. If you've got a level of expertise, most people are not going to have that. And I was like, this guy's a scientist or something. And it just stuck with me. And I happened to see him in Speaker's Corner. And I went to introduce myself. We went to have dinner that night. We had a chat after Speaker's Corner, and we became friends. I actually went with him when he interviewed a couple of the people. So Roger Penrose, I met in person, Richard Gott. So a couple of the videos that he has on his channel, I was only a couple, 2 or 3, I think I helped him with. And then I moved away, unfortunately. And I'd help, set up his video stuff and listen in and stuff. And it was, it's awe-inspiring when you meet extraordinary people, right? And somebody like Sir Roger Penrose, an extraordinary individual, very soft handshake, obviously more elderly now. But when I sat and listened, you're in the presence of somebody whose mind is on a different level. And you can just, it's like, meeting, if you were into athletics, Usain Bolt, just an extraordinary human being. And Roger Penrose is the Usain Bolt, or one of them at least, in his field of expertise. And I think those are the sort of memories I have with that. But just with Skydive Phil himself, just so knowledgeable, just such a nice person. And when he went down there, the only, if there was, because I think somebody was speaking about it recently, a friend of mine that was on Clubhouse was speaking about it. The only thing, if there was any critique, Skydive was so humble, and he would also couch his language because he knew more than most people. This is the fascinating thing about like what might be termed the Dunning-Kruger effect. The idea that people that don't know very much vastly overestimate their abilities, and they're very sure and self-confident in their ignorance, essentially. And people that are informed are far more cautious about what they say because they realize there's caveats, there's other views out there and that sort of stuff. And it's just a very skewed idea. And I've come across that such a lot over the last 7 years. And Skydive Phil, as an example, is one of those on the knowledgeable end that couches his language. And to the layperson who's not paying attention, who doesn't realize it, it can almost sound like he's not sure. But in fact, because he knows so much, he's trying to be very careful about the way he says something so that it doesn't sound like he's stepping too far outside of the bounds of what he should be saying and so forth. But on the downside, that's where I say that the layperson goes, "Oh, doesn't sound like," when he says, "Oh, I don't know, it could be this, it could be that." That's because that's what the scientific community say. Now, most lay people want a clear-cut, black and white answer, and that's not often the case. So, yeah, I could speak about all the other people as well that you mentioned, but he was one, and yeah, as I say, many of the others. I love speaking to the ex-Muslims as well. I'm very sensitive to ex-Muslims and some of the struggles they've gone through. I've spoken to some at Speaker's Corner and online, and some of the stories are pretty harrowing. And I've always got a lot of respect for people, because it's not just, leaving Islam and changing their religion or going out of religion, as the case may be, but there's also all the other considerations around the community and how they treat it and so forth. So I'm always wary and very respectful and very admiring of people like that have gone through all of that and have gone through those struggles, gone through the work of deciding that they didn't believe Islam was true, and and having the bravery, hopefully, and where they are based, to be able to speak out as they have. And I always want to support people like that. So Harris Sultan,
say apostate prophet and master
apostate prophet, of course. Abdullah Samir and so forth. I don't know if Vidoviz is still doing it. I thought he stopped doing it at some point.
He briefly came back
okay.
towards, I think it was the end of last year and the start of this year. He was on Secular Jihadists for a while with Harris Sultan and Armin Navabi. They were kind of three of them were doing shows together, but he seems to have dropped off the map again. But yeah, he was obviously a pretty big name at the time, doing all his kind of humorous videos and stuff. So the fact that he came on 3 times was, again, pretty impressive. One of the noticeable things about that list is the distinct lack of Muslim guests. And Rob and I were talking about this just before we went live. It's always been extremely hard to get Muslims of any quality in terms of their knowledge and the way they argue their point to come on the Gin and Tonic Show. I'm gonna bring up everybody's favorite, Kenny Bomer. He made a couple of appearances, but there was one particularly long 2-hour discussion. I don't have a particularly high opinion of this person, and I won't speak for you, Rob, but what do you remember of that show, if anything at all, of having Kenny on?
I don't remember that particular show. I do remember a couple of interactions with Kenny. And again, these days I'm reticent to, speak particularly poorly of people or anything like that. I do think that they weren't particularly sort of high-level discussions. And it sort of strikes me that, there are actually 1 or 2 Muslims of the last few years, especially online, that I've spoken to that are, I would consider, more substantive interlocutors. I think Kenny's like, a number of other Muslims where they're very certain, they think they know Islam well, they think they've got all the answers. But when you start to sort of peek underneath the surface level, there's not a lot there. And I think that's where, I'm not necessarily saying it's specific to Kenny, but that's where the rhetoric and the debate tactics come in, because, it doesn't matter how good you are, you still have to defend Islam. And that itself is challenging, especially when it's put under the spotlight and you take a sort of more critical look at it. It doesn't matter how good you are, but I think when you run out of intellectual or the attempt to intellectually defend it, then it becomes a rhetorical flourish. And I think, Kenny and others are sort of fall into that sort of arena of doing that and then appealing to the audience. Now, luckily for us, we had an audience primarily on, even though it was a small one, on Gin and Tonic, who were quite discerning. So it wasn't like, any of the rhetorical flourishes were going to work on them, but I could see how it would work on lay people out in the street and so forth, who are not used to having these sort of discussions. So I think there were a few moments where it was sort of heated. I don't recall if it was so much heated with myself. I think it was certainly more heated with Stops. I think I had a little bit more patience, and I've grown even. I don't know if I've grown more patient, but I'm certainly still patient to a degree, because doing it now online, especially on Clubhouse, if you go into what's called a Muslim room, so the rooms are hosted by Muslims, you've got to have patience because they will kind of drone on a little bit. And if you say anything that's marginally insulting, it gives them an excuse to kick you off. So I've become kind of very sort of polite in that way, more so perhaps than even before, so that I don't give them an excuse. But I think Stops doesn't have that level of patience, and he's going to be a lot more blunt. So I vaguely remember him sort of having a bit more fireworks than perhaps I did. I'd have to listen back to it, but I think he was probably more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think your recall was pretty good, yes, because and I am going to put out that episode, or it's going to be somewhat edited because there were times when Kenny was just preaching for sort of 5-10 minutes at a time. So, but I'm going to put out the heart of it, and yes, it's exactly as you said. It was you were fairly level-headed with it, but Stops and him there were sparks flying on quite a few occasions, and Kenny in particular was getting very enraged towards the end of the conversation, and there was almost he was demanding a debate almost in like a threatening kind of way towards Stops, which was it showed the level which it kind of got to. As you say, once Kenny's had run out of his arguments, his emotions kind of took over in a big way. And yeah, I mean, it was I suppose in some level it was kind of entertaining, but yeah, it was it showed, unfortunately, how difficult it was to get noted Muslims who would come onto the Gin and Tonic Show and deliver a more convincing argument from their position. Not that I think there are any convincing arguments for Islam, but certainly there are people who probably would have presented themselves better. I do remember there were a number of regular Muslims you had over the years that did come on and were more sensible. I'm thinking particularly of a guy called Smart Cat. I don't know if you remember him. He was
yes, I do. Yeah, he was American, or at least North American accent, if memory serves.
Yeah, and he was even joined you to review some of the Dawah videos, and he was I thought one of the most balanced kind of Muslims. I think he was willing to actually criticize where something had been argued poorly on the video, which was quite rare, I thought, for a Muslim guest. So I don't want to say that there were no Muslims who came on the show that didn't do a reasonable job, but I think they were few and far between. And I think that it's that kind of thing I think will impact on the show, because if you can get someone who is a more professional kind of interlocutor, I think it helps build an audience there. But I think the Gin and Tonic Show was almost blacklisted by a lot of the known Muslims, because they were, well, it was the usual, you're Islamophobic, you're racist, you're just a bunch of haters, all this kind of rhetoric. And I think that sort of was spread around by the likes of, say, Hamza from Hamza's Den and that kind of apologist. So because I remember Jordan M actually came on to one, it wasn't the Gin and Tonic Show, but it was your Speaker's Corner channel. It was the only kind of noted name that I can remember. And I think he joined you for a video review for a while, and again a few sparks flew between him and the Stops. But other than that, I can't think of any other noted names. And I mean, and I think when you tried to go on their streams, didn't you end up getting blocked as well? I think
I did go on once, but I was also of the view that having 4 or 5 Muslims on one, and them being able to, it essentially, I take those sort of live streams to be propagandist type things, because they won't come out of their safe space and do it one-on-one. and so it's a 4 or 5 on one. And I don't want to do it in a formal way. I want to have a discussion around a topic or whatever the case is. In those days, I also didn't really want to defend quote unquote atheism. I'll do that now because I have got, I think, good arguments for atheism. Or let me put it this way, good arguments to show that theism is either untrue or cannot be the case, which is a very strong claim. Most atheists won't make that claim. I will defend that claim. But I would have preferred that. So I did go on once and they had a conversation, but they did eventually sort of bring it to a close. And again, I sometimes I'd listen back to things and I'd actually sort of critique myself. And, I've made, a number of mistakes in the past myself. So now I would go on, but I'd choose 1 or 2 people. I would set some conditions, have 3, 4, 5 on one. I'm just not interested in that. I do that already on Clubhouse, and that can be frustrating because I want to hone in on 1 or 2 people, and I don't want to go for the low-hanging fruit. I'd rather speak to somebody who's a more sensible interlocutor, somebody that we can have an honest conversation without it getting emotional, whatever the case is. And you can't really do it with those live Dawah channels so much, unfortunately, because it is about trying to look good or making Islam look good and make the whoever the challenger is Islam look bad. And when you've got 5 on one, there's always going to be somebody who can say something, bring up something that another interlocutor doesn't think about. So it's not really a level playing field in that sense. Not that I think 5 of them, even to myself or to whoever, I'm not the best, as I say. But even that, I don't think they've combined that they've got the intellectual prowess to defend Islam per se. I'm not saying that they are silly people or they're low IQ. I'm not saying that, but I think even 3 or 4 or 5, but it doesn't give you time to offer a substantial critique. And then you got 3, 4, 5 all jumping in at once. And because they all make different points, it's very difficult then to follow up and do it. So now you've got to try and hone in on 1 or 2 of the more important points. And that can become kind of tedious after a while. So I did do it, I think at least once, maybe twice, but I just found that kind of tiring and not a sort of playing field that I would want to do. But if like you arranged it and say it was hijab or whoever it might be, then I'd be open to doing that on a particular topic. But I'm also, with those guys, I'm very aware of the debate tactics, and that's something that I'm going to highlight, because now my view is I'm not there primarily to try and grind people or to expose them or make them look foolish. I think, to whatever degree, I'll leave that to the discerning audience. All I'm going to do is offer the critiques and so forth, and kind of show. And I've changed the way I do discussions, which we can talk about hopefully at some point as well, because I've been through doing it in various different ways, and I think I've learned obviously a lot of stuff over the time. So I'd love to do it with 1 or 2 of them. And I see Nikhil asking about having an ongoing Muslim guest. Again, we could look for somebody on Clubhouse. I think there's 1 or 2 people that I could say are decent interlocutors. They don't get offended. I mean, if you go start shouting, whatever obscenities that from their point of view, they probably wouldn't like that. But I was on speaking to somebody today, as it happens, for a little while, and he's a Quranist, but a very reasonable guy. He'll listen quietly. He'll respond. I'll listen quietly, and that's kind of a rarity, because most of the time there's over talking and that sort of stuff. So again, I could find somebody like that. You could ask him if he wants to come on. I have noticed, just as a side point, that Quranists are much harder to have a discussion with, because they just, for people who don't know, Quranist is somebody that only accepts the Quran as the primary and only method of interpreting and understanding Islam. They don't appeal to scholars. They don't appeal to hadith. They don't appeal to Muhammad's biography or any other secondary or tertiary information. It's the Quran itself, and they do so through their own subjective interpretation lens, which means that they can interpret something kind of in any which way they want. So they're more difficult interlocutors to deal with, because they're not appealing to the history of, let's say, scholarship or whatever the case is. But yes, I think there would be somebody who would go on there, Nikhil, that might want to go on once a month or something like that you could have as a regular guest, and would be a decent interlocutor, not like sort of somebody that doesn't know a lot or thinks that they know a lot and in fact is quite uninformed.
I've noticed that with some Quranists, which I've spoken to, they will accept some hadiths, but it seems to be entirely arbitrary. They'll say
correct.
It's entirely down to how they want to interpret it, and anything that falls outside of that bubble, they'll just instantly dismiss. And when you say, well, what method are you using to determine which are the authentic ones and which aren't. And they don't really have a good answer. It's basically just whatever I feel like, which is infuriating, really, because then it's, you've got hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of hadiths which you can refer to. And you might think, okay, well, this contradicts your position. They'll look at it and say, no, that's not real. That's not authentic, which I find is that level of cherry picking, I think, is quite frustrating.
Yeah, that's why a number of them just don't accept any hadiths, because they recognize that appealing to any hadith, you are going to be caught in this sort of unpleasant situation of trying to justify why you accept some Sahih hadiths and not others. And who are you to make that subjective decision? You're not a scholar, etc., etc. And if you're saying, well, I'm choosing the ones that don't conflict with Islam, well, then how is it that, that the other ones have been deemed Sahih? And, if you are thinking they are conflicting with the Quran, how is it that scholars don't think that's the case? Because I do think that is a principle. If something contradicts the Quran, then it's not to be taken as authoritative. And so if it's the case, perhaps it's your interpretation. And that's something maybe we could just talk about briefly. A lot of the time when I was speaking to Muslims in Speaker's Corner, I'd learn some of, and I've read the Quran and I've learned some of the, particular verses and so forth that are either critiques or the verses that they will bring as sort of defenses. And we can talk about what, the arguments, quote unquote, that they bring to show that Islam is true, because that just generally we won't have to go into them necessarily in any depth, but certainly the ones they bring. But what I have realized, and it sort of occurred to me after a while, but I didn't sort of pay that close attention. And again, Venus brought it to my attention about doing this interpretation. So you'd read a verse and you'd say, okay, it means this. And your Muslim interlocutor would say, no, that's not what it means. It means X. And you'd look at the tafsirs, which is, for those people who don't know, some of the interpretations by well-known Muslim scholars going back, hundreds, if not 1,000 years. So people like Al-Jalalain and Ibn Kathir and these sort of people who are sort of more, let's call them early scholars in the sense of being, renowned, not interpreters of the verses, but giving explanation of what the verses mean, as opposed to the interpretations like Pickthall or Yusuf Ali or whatever it might be. And so what tended to happen, they would have a different interpretation. But when it suited them, they'd have a literal interpretation as a straightforward reading. And when you brought a critique, then they wouldn't take it. So, beating your wife. No, some of them would say, it doesn't mean beating your wife. It means leaving her, moving apart from her, whatever, or using a miswak, like a little,
toothbrush,
feather type thing, toothpick type thing to, quote, beat her and all this sort of stuff. So all this sort of gymnastic apologetics would be put forward. And anybody who's paying attention, right, could just see that this was utter nonsense. But there wasn't a place where you could show that there was a problem that they had to accept, that any rational person would accept, because they had these various techniques of sidestepping the interpretation critiques, as I would call it. So I do a lot less of that now, purely because I'm now aware of this, and because Venus brought it to my attention. I really sort of was more focused on hearing what happened when that happened. A great example, not so long ago, in the last 3 or 4 months probably, I was on Clubhouse and I went to quite a hostile Muslim room, as it turned out, because I'll go to rooms where there's primarily Muslims or Christians. Obviously, there's some atheists, some very smart atheists, and I hang out, but I typically want to speak to people who believe in God rather than hang out with my fellow atheists primarily. So I'll go to other rooms on my own. And actually, in some ways, I prefer that. But I went to one room and they wanted to present to me a reason that Islam is true. And probably one of the worst things you can do with me in particular is tell me that there is a prediction or a scientific miracle in the Quran. So prediction being something that couldn't have been known at the time that comes true. And a scientific miracle is, again, something that people at the time wouldn't have known about the world around us, and that we've only discovered recently. And Islam, quote unquote, clearly in the Quran points to that 1400 years ago. How could that be the case? The only answer, according to many Muslims who present this, is that it must have been God. And so in this particular scenario, which really brought it home to me, the guy brought up a verse, and we could look it up here and you could immediately do it. There's a verse about kind of talking about end times, where the basic idea is there's going to be these waves upon waves. It's going to be a dark ocean. It's going to be like, it's a storm or whatever the case is. The idea then, they said, what do you understand? And I said, to me, it sounds like a metaphor for, being separated from God. It's going to be like you're all at sea. You don't know where you're going. It's nighttime. It's storming. It's very unpleasant. They took from this particular verse, this waves upon waves, and they said, this is miraculous. And I went, oh, really? How's that? No, because what it refers to is you've got the waves on top of the ocean, but then you've got these waves under the ocean. And they proceeded to bring up a definition. So they had this all prepared. They didn't know I was coming. I didn't know about this either myself. And we just happened to talk, and they brought this up, thinking this is very, very convincing. And they brought me this definition that somebody had said, well, yes, there are these waves underwater, which is typically like currents. We typically understand them to be currents. So I quickly looked on Google while they were chatting away, because people tend to chat for ages when they're trying to do this. They're not clear and concise. That's a skill that most people don't have. So I looked it up, and I found a whole PDF about waves, and it talked about waves being between the ocean, the top of the ocean, and the atmosphere. And that was one of the things that I picked up on just doing a quick Google search. So I presented this to them, and they were very emphatic. They all, believe it or not, again, this is not all Muslims. This particular, I was dishonest because I didn't accept their, to my mind, idiosyncratic definition that somebody had come up with to say that there's waves on top of the ocean and underneath. If you ask most people about waves, they're going to say, well, it's on top of the ocean. That's the current, normal understanding. And they became quite hostile about this whole thing, not saying I was dishonest, etc. And what I did is I said, look, you're just not going to convince me here. You're trying to say that my definition, the one that's, I think, is the typical, well accepted, words have, definitions or words have particular meanings. And I typically take the one where it's commonly understood, not idiosyncratic, understanding. Because somebody could take a word and just say, oh, well, this is what it means, but they stand on their own. I'm going to be not very impressed with that sort of approach. I think they have general uses and their widespread adoption and understanding. And that's typically what I'm going to take. So like I said, they were hostile with this. And I said, look, this is just never going to work with me. And then I gave them a counterexample. I said to them, look, you guys are not, what about this? If I said to you, but the earth is laid flat like a carpet, I said, that to me straightforwardly, points to the fact that it's referring to a flat disc-shaped earth, right? That's what flat earth seems to suggest, because you've never seen a carpet that's like an oblate spheroid, which is the technical term for the shape of the earth. And of course, one of the Muslims, and again, this guy was a classic Dunning-Kruger guy. I won't mention his name, but by Dunning-Kruger, he was a guy that spoke the most and knew the least. But in his utter ignorance, he thought he was saying something profound. So he pipes up and basically makes my point for me. And he goes, no, what it actually means, that on that model that you put forward, the poles are slightly flattened and it bulges at the equator. So he goes, and so what it can be referring to, what it does refer to, either can or does refer to, is this flattened area on the poles. That's what this flat like a carpet means. And I just pointed out to them that he had, in fact, done exactly what I said, which is interpret a verse in a particular way to make it consistent with the world around me. And I was just never going to accept it. And so that brought home to me this idea that doing the interpretation backwards and forwards, you're just not going to get very far. Anybody who's listening who isn't a Muslim is going to see the point. The Muslims, however, are very unlikely to go, you know what, you've got the right interpretation. I'm going to give up on my idea. So, because my idea was, can I get Muslims to reevaluate their position? That was my primary motivation, not to speak to people who already believe what I believe, who are, not Muslim. They're obviously going to virtually agree with most things that I say. But can I get Muslims to reevaluate some of the bad ideas they have? And this is one of them. So I apologize for the long sort of story there, but I think that brought home to me that this interpretation type critique is not very effective in getting Muslims to kind of shift at all. We can see that it's wrong. I think the conceptual ideas, there's a few things like, and we could always talk about it at some point, like the test, the idea of life as a test. I think that's deeply problematic.
Yes.
And if I walk somebody through my reasoning on that, even if you're a reasonable Muslim, you're going to find it exceptionally hard to rebut that critique. Nobody has done it that I've seen in any effectual way. And so even if you're a Muslim, you might go, yeah, I can kind of see that, right? What I typically find with the conceptual type ideas, when you offer by my lights a strong conceptual critique, here's one of the tactics to listen for. And if you do this drastic, you'll see it. When people can't answer something, they will give some response, right? So the first time you say X, they'll say Y. and then you'll give a response to their response. So they call it my response number 2. But because they don't have anything else to respond with, they will rehash their response number 1 to my response number 2. And of course, I'm very familiar with this now. So I'm just saying, you're just repeating the same point. You're not offering a rebuttal to my rebuttal. You're just repeating the first thing you said to the first thing that I said. I've now given you a rebuttal to why I think what you've just said is wrong. But because they can't go deeper, they just repeat it. And I think those conceptual ideas, I think, are more effective in the sense that it sort of can highlight their either lack of thinking or the irrationality when faced with these ideas. But then I've also found that you've got to do it in a consistent way, so everybody can follow along, especially people who are not familiar with Islam. It's basic reasoning, and because I'm not a philosophical expert, although I've looked into some philosophy, I want to make it simple so people can follow. And on occasions, people will message me when I've had these discussions on Clubhouse now and go, yeah, that was amazing. I followed along really well. And that for me is kind of quite good, because then I know that I'm getting across to most people in a way that, the majority can understand.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely, I agree with you. In terms of that life as a test, I find it incredibly frustrating, because I think it's such a bad argument, and I'm planning to do a detailed video on this, because it comes up in every Dawah video almost, this same repeated point, and there's so many holes in it. But we'll come on to or we'll kind of swing back to Clubhouse and kind of what you're doing now in a moment. But I just wanted to quickly return to the Gin and Tonic Show, just to kind of wrap up your time there. So at the end of 2019, and I think Nick made a comment about this. He says he remembers the slavery episode when Stops lost his shit. Now, I think the one he's talking about was at the end of 2019, when there was a Muslim who came on he wasn't just saying that slavery was okay in Muhammad's time. He was pretty much defending slavery for all time, and he was using this kind of Islamic supremacism where it's fine for Muslims to do it to non-Muslims, but not the other way around. And it really affected Stops to the point where the show went on hiatus for 3 months. I think at that point there was a bit of a sea change, because when you came back, it was in February 2020, and the pandemic was just starting to hit, which meant that Speaker's Corner was kind of shut down and that kind of thing. And although you carried on for another 18 months, you carried on until the middle of July. It did feel like, I was still enjoying the show, but it felt like that there'd been a bit of a sea change in how things are happening. There wasn't quite as much engagement. I suppose I'm bringing all this up because obviously you got to the point in the summer of 2021, and it was 16th of July was your last show. And even though you were kind of saying, yes, we might be back at some point, that never happened. So looking back now, why did you decide to end it there? And had you already decided, or were you still thinking about it and then you just decided not to come back? Or was it, if you could just sort of tell us your thoughts on that, why you ended up stopping the show?
So for what I remember, I think it just got to a point where it sort of had become stale. We had covered most of the topics. We had started to read the Quran on a regular basis. And even that, had become kind of quite tedious to do. And it just got to the point where it felt like there wasn't something new that we could bring. I think what, could revitalize it, or would have revitalized it, if we had decent Muslim interlocutors. I think that's the thing that we really missed having, because we can do all the critiques, and all the people in the audience for the most part are people that sort of see it the same way we do and can kind of see, the problems that we're highlighting. But I just think that it got to the point where, like you say, there probably was a change. I don't remember specifically. But it was a case of we'll see what happens. It wasn't like we're done and we're just saying that. But I think it once we got to that point in, as you say, in July, because I didn't remember the date specifically, it was like, what else can we do to infuse something new here? And it just didn't feel like we could do that. I think Stops would have continued if I had sort of asked him to do so. But I think, I was feeling at that stage that I'm not bringing anything new here. And it's just us speaking to people out there, and there's not that much engagement. Had we had a bigger audience, I think that would have encouraged us to continue. And also, maybe if we kind of made more effort to try and find interlocutors to come on the show, that might have kept it going. I think it just got to the point where for us, or at least for me, that we weren't doing anything new, and there wasn't also that I guess you could say a willingness to kind of put a huge effort into trying to keep it going. And I'm so thankful that Nikhil and the other guys have sort of taken that over, because they've brought it in a different way. They've gone almost like perhaps even more academic than we have, which I think is great, bringing up a variety of topics that may have been covered superficially on our shows and stuff like that, but they seem to put more time into it. So I think, shout out to them. And if you are watching, do take a look at the show, because you'll find it in a different way. And one is not better than the other. I think it just depends on the kind of view that, the way that you want to listen to and engage in different shows. So I think that's,
yeah, I mean, as you say, the show has gone through many incarnations in terms of, when it first started, it was, there was it was kind of brand new. So it was kind of covering the topics for the first time. So it had that freshness. Then when Klingshaw and Stopps were doing it, they got very much into the historical side, because I think Klingshaw was studying Islam, and I think the current guys have gone back to that now. They're doing kind of deeper dives into the history and things like that. So I think it's healthy that it kind of changes with each new host. We'll kind of do something new. So I'm still watching the show,
I don't get to, unfortunately. That was the other thing, just to add, I apologize, just to add in that on the Friday, I also, do work sometimes over weekends and Thursday, Friday. So that also became a bit of a challenge where I couldn't actually be on it. It would be Stopps, or you'd have to get somebody else. And I know we did get, sort of stand-in guests and stuff like that as well. So I think, if I were ever to do something like that again, I'd probably find a different day of the week where it's far less likely I'm going to clash with, some other work that I have on. So I'd probably still do it in the evening, but it might be like a Monday, Tuesday, or a Wednesday, something like that, rather than later in the week. So that became a bit of a challenge as well. So, and I think that was another reason where I didn't want to keep doing that, or leaving Stopps, or not being there, when it was the two of us. And like I said, we had some great stand-in guest hosts as well, which was awesome.
You had Thunderous was on regularly through.
That's right. Yes,
most of the time you're doing it, at least the last few years, he was there. He was almost a third co-host. He was on that regularly, and
he was a Christian, of course, and that's of course where you will sort of agree with Christians, because the critiques there specifically are against specific ideas in Islam. Obviously, if it's going to be just about the God view, then Thunderous is going to agree with the Muslims, generally speaking. But he was quite a fierce critic as well of Islam, sometimes more so than us, in the sense of like his passion for it, if you like.
Well, he was an ex-Muslim as well, wasn't he? So he was coming from that perspective, and I think you can tell from listening to those shows when I've gone back that there was I think he had a bad time of it when leaving Islam and stuff like that, without going into too much detail. So I think there was some hostility maybe, but I found it was a refreshing kind of side to it, rather than just having non-believers on. You had that different perspective, as well as being an ex-Muslim, and he had good knowledge of it, of the religion. But
that's right.
It did occasionally lead to a few sparks, again, mostly with Stopps, when he'd make an irreverent comment about believers, and Thunderous might get a little bit. And
I can understand that, right? I think, and again, that's why I love Stopps. He's not sort of always cautious of what he says, especially with interlocutors there. And if you were hosting a show with, let's say, with Thunderous being the main host, for example, and he says, "Yeah, these unbelievers." Right, you probably, now I've learned not to, that's just water off a duck's back to me. It just floats past me. What I've learned over time is to focus on, and this is something somebody told me many, many years ago, and I think it's more prevalent now even than before, is to focus on the bigger fires, focus on the bigger points. Because when I have discussions with people, I've got a specific idea, or I'm specifically focused on a particular idea. But what people will tend to do, especially when they're under pressure or they don't know what to say, they start to throw out other ideas. And if you're not an experienced interlocutor, you'll get caught on going off on one of those ideas. And even now, sometimes I've got to catch myself, because they'll say something so silly that it's easy to go down that route and go and deal with that, because it's like a small fire that you should be able to blow out in a single puff. But really, you're talking about this bigger bonfire here that you want to deal with and get some resolution or some progress with. And I think that's something to remember to do, is to keep your eye on the ball when you're talking about a specific topic, because people will just make it very easy. And it's the same when you are responding. Not to volunteer information that can take people off on a tangent, because I occasionally still do that. I try not to. And my answers, obviously, because you're asking me questions, I'll be a bit more verbose here. But typically when I'm having discussions, I'm much more concise and clear. And I don't offer a great deal of information more, because it allows people to sidetrack conversations. And that's something I'm very cautious and very focused on not allowing to happen. It's just like a subconscious way out, especially if the going gets tough. You want to find a way out, and the mind will look for that subconsciously. The person might not be doing it, overtly, but as soon as they hear something, off they go off on a tangent, start talking about something else. It's like, oh, I've got out of that thing, let me talk about X. But Stops would do that occasionally. And so I think, and that's just because he'd been doing it so long as well, and that's huge credit to him, that sometimes you just don't want to sort of focus all your attention on one thing. And if something silly comes up, you just want to say it straight off the cuff. But then if you have somebody like Thunderous there, then, sometimes he'd be quiet about it. Other times he might just speak up. And I don't blame him for doing so, because, he is a theist, and, if he's a guest host, then we want to focus it more on Islam. And I think occasionally Stops would kind of forget that. I don't blame him in any way. I mean, if you're being on there and you've just got the idea about theism because sometimes it's easy to conflate, Islam with theism generally. And that's easy to do, and especially if something so silly comes up and in your mind you go, well, all theists think this way. It might not be the case, or even if you think it is, if you've got a theist co-host, it might not be useful to articulate that out loud sometimes.
Well, yeah, I thought that was good in that sense. Another strength of your partnership was that, on the one hand, Stops could always interject a bit of humour if maybe things was getting slightly dry, which I thought was nice. But on the other hand, you could maybe rein in some of Stops's how best to describe it, kind of, well, I suppose irreverence in a way, and you could kind of keep him focused, and so I think it works really well, that partnership. But yeah, I mean, I noticed a difference that when, particularly with Thunderous being on, you would always use the language very much focused on Islam, where sometimes Stops would slip into the more generalized talking about theism. So yeah, I could see why there was occasional sparks, but I think overall those episodes were few and far between, and I think for the most part it was a good kind of three-way critique of whatever issue you were looking at. So
I definitely valued the time that Thunderous was there as well. He offered the extra critique, and then we had other people that would pop on as well. So and everybody brings something different. They've got a slightly different way of seeing it. And you can always pick up something. I think that the biggest thing is like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't think about it that way. Stops got me to think about things differently on many occasions. Thunder is the same, and other people as well. So I think the biggest thing that I can take away is from all of the people that were on, even the Muslims themselves, but particularly the critics, is they all bring something to the table. And I think those are the things I'm more interested in focusing on now, because maybe I can. My rhetorical retorts might be, better than others, but they've got ways of saying things that are better than mine, or in a way that helps people better understand. I go, that's useful. I'll try to remember that. So that's what I've tried to do. And I'm more focused on that now, especially when I come across, what I consider to be good interlocutors. I sort of pay close attention because I recognize my limitations, and I can see people who are smarter than me. And I'm like, okay, that's great. I'm going to quote unquote borrow that, the way you said that, the way you explained that, or whatever the case is. I couldn't have quite done it that way. So I'm going to, respectfully borrow, that idea or the way you've articulated that. But yeah, looking back on it, just on Gin and Tonic, to finish that off, I think it was something that I can look back on and go, yeah, that was enjoyable for the most part. As I say, towards the end, it became, less so. But certainly the relationship I've had with Stops, meeting yourself, Thunderous, and all the people that made that show, and Dave that was often in the comments, and many of the people that listened, and we sometimes go into the Discord. That's a part that I can sort of keep fond memories of, meeting those people, having even if it was simply an online relationship. And even some of the people at Speaker's Corner I got to know, and even some of the Muslim interlocutors, we'd smile and kind of shake hands or whatever the case is. And especially, people on my side of the fence, they were far more rare in Speaker's Corner. But we'd shake hands almost like, we were pals from, some time back or whatever the case. I'm sure if I went back there and if I recognized any of them, we'd shake hands and catch up, shoot the breeze, so to speak. So it is something for the most part that I look back on fondly.
Yeah. And I mean, going through the archive, it's been enjoyable for me just to kind of have that trip down memory lane. As I say, each week I'm going to be putting out a kind of clip, I suppose, because I gave up on the idea of trying to chapter all the shows. There's just too much work. I'd end up doing it for the rest of my life, I think. But I'm going to do particular bits that I personally really enjoyed. So it'll be a mixture of video reviews, presentations, and just kind of general conversations with Muslims, because there were quite a lot, particularly in the earlier years. You did have a fair number of ordinary Muslims come on and some big conversations. And I think there's but particularly what you offered, Rob, was this very analytical way of breaking down, like you said, the tactics that they use, the distractions, the dreadful analogies. I think that's useful, and I'm hoping that I can bring a new audience to look at the work you've done, because, as you say, it was never a huge audience. You did used to get thousands of views on some of the episodes, so it's probably maybe better than you remember. But yeah, I'm going to bring a kind of best of the Gin and Tonic show over the next few months so people can enjoy them again. So if you ever want to come back and just listen to an old episode, if you've got some time, then hopefully you'll find something that oh yeah, I remember that conversation, that was good fun, kind of thing. So
absolutely, and I appreciate the time that you're putting into that. And if you want to do a show with Stops and I, and we shoot the breeze and have the shared memories, I know you've spoken to him at some point, relatively recently, I think. Well, and now myself. So if you want to do the two of us, I still have him on Skype, and I still, we, like I say, we'll catch up once in a while. It particularly if I think about something and I think of him, he'll suddenly pop into my mind. And like, oh yeah, that's what Stops would say, or this is something that sort of. So I would be very happy to kind of do that show. But then let's do it on a day, or let's have plenty of time, because I think that sort of show will go on for at least 3 hours probably. Which hopefully if people enjoy it and we're enjoying it and you are, I don't have a problem with doing something like that. And I think
I'd love
2 or 3 hours with ease.
I'd love to. I mean, because I was almost tempted to sort of message Stops and say, look, I'm going to be speaking to Rob. But I think partly because, as you say, I have interviewed him once already, talking about the show, and I wanted to get kind of your unique perspective. But also I didn't feel like I didn't want to be pestering him, because he's already done one interview with me. So I didn't want him to feel I was asking too much. But yeah, I mean, if you both wanted to come on again, I would love that. And I'm sure there'd be an audience who sort of want to listen to that reunion, if you like. So, and I
hope if you say, hey, Rob's interested in doing that, that'll give him some impetus. And it certainly would for me as well, to go, hey, let's catch up again. We haven't done that for a while. And some things have changed sort of in my life a little bit as well. So who knows what the future, anything's possible in the future. At the moment, I wouldn't go back to sort of hosting regular shows, even weekly or bi-weekly, but certainly I can occasionally pop on as a guest or something like that. But I would never rule out that it's impossible to do another show with Stops or yourself or indeed other people. Just it's probably not the right time at the moment, if it does ever happen again.
No, sure. And actually, that was another thing I was going to ask you, because there was a reunion last year. You did mention it earlier in the show, earlier in the stream, the 11th anniversary. So last October, both you and Stops were there, and it was, and I was also on the show, and it was a really nice get together. So I was going to ask, would you be willing to come on again this year to Gin and Tonic Show for the 12th anniversary, as it will be then?
When is that, more or less?
That'll be mid-October.
October, just having a look. Yeah, mid-October, just looking in the diary, probably could fit that in. Yeah, mid-October.
Oh, by the way, Nick, sorry, I just say to Nick, he's in the chat. Sorry if it feels like I'm booking your show. Obviously, this is Nick and Moose are running the show, but I'm sure they'd love to have you.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I thought you meant on here. But yeah, I'd be happy to pop on with Stops and chat to Nick and Moose. That's for sure. Not a problem at all. And mid-October, currently at the moment, just quickly looking at my diary, looks free. But I'm sure between us we can work something out. So if they'd like to, I'm sure we could do that. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you and Stops want to come on my channel again, I'd love to host you, and I can accommodate most kind of UK daytimes, most evenings I can do. So I mean, yeah, if you want you guys to come on here, that'd be great. I'd happily do it. And
reach out to him. You've got my details. Even I would say, in the next in the next couple of weeks, I'm really busy. But apart from that, sort of end of June, July time this year, I could fit something in during the week. And like I say, it would be great to chat to him again for an extended period of time. Like I say, we might catch up. We mostly catch up on text now. We don't sort of speak, and it'll be good to do that again with yourself and anybody else that you want to bring. I'd say the biggest thing there is just make sure that we've got time. Let's start 7:00 UK time, because we might not finish before 10 at the earliest. And depending on how many people you bring in, it'll be good to hear from, anybody else that you think would contribute. But give it enough time, because I think an hour and a half probably won't do anywhere near enough, I think. And if it's less than 3 hours, it's fine, but I could easily see us taking 3 hours, and hopefully
absolutely
would find that interesting.
Stops is actually been a good supporter of my channel. Actually, he kind of makes semi-regular visits to leave comments and stuff, and he's been really great. So I'm sure he'd be up for it. It would be
awesome.
It would be a fun conversation, I think. So so okay, so I was just going to swing back around again. I mean, we've touched on your Clubhouse time. So is there any? You're pretty much set up there exclusively now. You don't really use your YouTube channel anymore, do you, or anything like that? Have you completely given up making any more videos for your channel, or?
Well, at this moment in time, yes. I mean, if Stops was interested and we could find a time to do something one evening or something, I'd probably look to do that. But if we were going to do any sort of critiques, somebody would have to send us a critique, and I'd prefer it to be Muslim versus atheist type of critique, or even, if there was an interesting one from one of the Dawah channels, we could do one of those again. But I'm pretty much set up on Clubhouse, and I run, if you want on Clubhouse, I'd invite you to join Clubhouse. It's an app you can have on your phone. You can even have it on your computer via Club Deck. Club Deck is the application on the computer. With Clubhouse, however, you can only you've got to use a phone. So it's got to pick up a phone number, and that's the way it kind of verifies you. But you can't have the same phone number, which is linked to your account, on two different devices. So what you have to do is, I primarily use it on my phone, but if I want to sit on my computer and use Club Deck on the computer rather than the Clubhouse app on the phone, then I literally have to log in on the other application. It logs me out of the phone. Sends me a message, I think, or something like that. And then I've got to log in. So you can set up two different accounts and have one on your computer and one on your phone, but they'll be two separate. It'll be like Rob Speakers 2, for example. But I couldn't have the same Rob Speakers account running on two devices. But if you do go on there, I run a house, which is, I co-host a house, if you like. Just generally when we're around and we can chat. So it's not official or anything. And a house is like a group. So it's like a group of people that are in there. And when you start a room, which is think of it a bit like Discord, where you have a server, you have like a StreamYard chat here. You can have unlimited number of people in a room, and people will mod the room. Mod the room as like an admin to the room, like you are, facilitating this conversation. We'll facilitate that. I'll be involved. I actually do it with a Christian, really nice guy. Obviously, we disagree on ideologies, but it just reminds me that even though we're on the opposite ends of the ideological, theological spectrum, there are still, good people out there. Yes, he's conservative in his views, but he's a sort of person that could bring people to Christianity just by the way he shows up, right? Really nice guy, wants to get along with everybody. That's the sort of thing that I go, okay, I can use more of that. I could be even more friendly. Like, he's very warm and welcoming. And so we run that together, and, we get a fair amount of people, given, the small community that it is on Clubhouse. There's probably 500 active, maybe, sort of theists on Clubhouse that do this, if I had to just roughly guess, that at least we've come across. and so you'd probably find me on there whenever I'm around, and that's where we have these sort of discussions, and we keep it specifically on God Talk. It's called the God Talk House, and I co-host this with a guy called Andrew R. That's his actual name. He doesn't mind me saying that. That's the name he uses in public, and he's a Christian. We'd like to actually get a Muslim admin moderator as well. We just haven't found somebody that's willing to do that. We've approached a few and they were like, oh, we can't do that because it will not be seen well in our community. And that sort of tells you a lot about some of those communities. So, but that's where we do it. And I think the discussion there, I've learned a lot there, a lot, way more than I did just generally on philosophy and the way to argue there, because there's been high level interlocutors there, or higher level, let's just say, not super high level. There's a few, but certainly on the atheist side in particular, there's a couple of really smart people there that I've learned a lot from and continue to do.
Well, there you go, folks. I mean, you know where to find Rob. Get over on Discord. Rob, I was going to ask you, did you ever think about recording some of your conversations and putting them on your channel? Because I'm sure people would flock back to your channel and listen if you were. I don't know how easy that is to record stuff on Clubhouse. No.
It's not so easy on the phone because I use, the AirPods with a phone, and that even with the screen recording doesn't work well. And you get this message coming up on Clubhouse saying, oh, warning, you're not allowed to record, or, you don't have permission, or whatever the case. You can still record it, but if somebody complains, then in theory, you could get a warning or even have your account suspended on Clubhouse, although there are people that do. So a channel like Tom Rabbit.
I was gonna mention Tom Rabbit. Yeah, he's one of the main ones that I know. You've even featured a couple of times on his channel yourself, actually. I think right. Particularly a couple of run-ins you've had with a notorious Christian presuppositionalist called Darth Dawkins, who I'm sure some people will know that name. So I thought if Tom Rabbit he's been doing that for years. I thought. I figured that it was okay to record stuff. Maybe he's just very good at being.
He just takes recordings. He's got unique ways of getting recordings that you don't think somebody was recording. Quite how he does it, I don't know, but it's kind of interesting. So again, a bit of work that I don't feel like I have the time or the inclination to do at the moment. But yeah, I suspect that would regenerate the channel if I did enough of that regularly. But then it's sort of taking away from the speaker's corner type thing. So I think probably, to keep it sort of in line with that, I'd do either the Muslim live streams or the if there was a speaker's corner discussion that either you or somebody else said, what, this is an interesting one. Do you want to give your thoughts on this? Kind of like we did. So if you look back at the Speaker's Corner UK channel and have a look at some of the discussions as you did, Drastic, something like that, I could certainly be persuaded to do one every once in a while with Stops if he was interested. And we'd probably do it raw. We wouldn't go through it ahead of time. So we'd kind of be, doing it live in the moment because, otherwise there's a bit too much work involved. And if it's more than half an hour, that half an hour one can easily take us 2 hours or longer to review because we're going to stop at, regular intervals to point out, some of the problems that we notice. And it typically happens a lot. So, a review, as you've seen in the past, can run 2, 3, or 5, as many as 5 times longer than the actual original video. And we've had to break it sometimes into parts because it's taken so long.
Yeah, well, I mean, the kind of video reviews I do, I try to keep them under half hour, and mostly I do, but that tends to be, a 10 to 15 minute Dawah video, and that's just me doing it. So I know exactly the problems of that, and it's difficult to get that balance as well, because I think if it ends up going on 2 hours, I think you're asking a lot of your audience to sort of stick with it for that long, even though I think your analysis is really great. So yeah, if I come across any shorter videos, then maybe I'll send you a message, Rob, at some point. And if you guys do want to occasionally come up and do one, then I'm sure that'd be good.
I think people will stick with it at least some degree if it's live, because they can be commenting and offer some. And we did have people come in and do that. Sometimes we'd even have a few Muslim commentators comments come in. So I think people are prepared to sit through a 2 hour one when it's live. It doesn't feel like 2 hours, but if it's a recording and you see that it's going to run 2 hours, then it could be like, I'm not sure I'm going to sit through it. But if you start listening to a live, you don't know how long it's going to run for, and B, if you're engaged in the chat, oftentimes I'd see, people in the chat engaging with each other. So that makes the time go quicker. They might be half listening to us, half having a conversation with each other. So I think the live version can certainly run longer, and people who are on the live will be engaged. But you're right. People who then come to it late might not be as open to listening to a 2-hour back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, I did do a couple of reviews with Dave and also Smile. I don't know if you remember Smile. He was a
yes, I do. Yes,
show.
Both of them great guys.
Yeah, and we did a couple of really nice, and they were quite long. One of them was 1 hour, one of them was 2 hours, and they got pretty good viewership actually, considering my channel was so young at the start. Well, we'd done it so early in my YouTube career, shall we say? So yeah, it's a difficult balancing act, but yeah, I certainly think if you were to come up once in a while and do that, I think there'd still be a good audience for it, because you used to do. I was one of those people often in the chat, sort of listening and then engaging with everybody else in the chat. So yeah, it's I hope that you do do it once in a while, because that would be great. But
yeah, well, reach out to me. I mean, I could even sort of do one with you depending on time of day or part of the week or whatever, but once in a while, maybe once a month or once every couple of months or something like that. If you find something, send it over. I'll have a quick look at it just to see what I think of it. And then I could do one with you. I tend to kind of stop regularly because there'll be so many things that are problematic, and I want to kind of try to address them all. And maybe that's overkill, and maybe it's a case of looking for the highlights, so to speak. Otherwise it can drag on, and sometimes people appreciate it. So I guess it's trying to find a balance. But reach out to me, and I could always do one with you at some point.
That'd be great. Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep an eye out. As I say, I'm doing kind of fairly regular reviews, but they tend to be kind of the shorter ones, and my style is probably a bit more acerbic than yours. I think I do reasonable analysis, but I'm not afraid to throw in the odd curse word here and there. So if I obviously if we did one together, Rob, I'd behave myself a bit more. But
no, it's your show. If you want to give it a go and do that, that's no problem.
Well, look, I think I've come to the end of kind of the prepared questions that I had, and I've really enjoyed this chat. If there's anyone in the audience who wants to drop any more questions for Rob, Nick, Darth Dawkins, was that the dude that rage quit? Yeah, he rage quits everything. He's not a stable person.
Yeah, I've had 1 or 2 run-ins with him, and you just don't get anywhere. I know his argument. I know how to deal with it, and he's got a sort of a steamrolling, approach. He thinks he's asking these amazing questions, but then doesn't want people to actually respond. I do understand on occasions that people will ramble, and I'm kind of a little bit allergic to rambling myself. But then when he faces somebody that's a bit more substantial, then that's where the sort of meta conversation. Then he starts to complain about people and so forth, and cannot respond particularly well. But I think if it was a level playing field, I think he's quickly exposed. But he's a seasoned debater in the sense that he's got tactics that he can use and he will employ very quickly when he either doesn't know something or he can see it's not going to go well for him or whatever the case is. So he's a tricky person to deal with if you're not familiar. I wouldn't suggest, if you're not familiar with doing debates or discussions, that you sort of start with Dawkins, because you'll just get steamrolled. And not that he will say something substantial necessarily, but just that he's got these tactics for and particularly if he's a mod, or he has some authority in the sense that he can moderate how the discussion works. That's just a non-starter. You just it's just like suicide going in there to do that.
I personally think it's not even worth talking to somebody like that. I mean, he's a train wreck. I think he's just uses bully tactics when he talks to people. So he's not interested.
Yeah, I don't either. I agree.
It's
I don't look for him.
It's a monologue with him, isn't it?
The only time I've done it is when he's either spoken to me, or on the occasion when Andrew, my co-host, one point early on in our sort of collaboration, asked me to have a conversation. And part of it was recorded, unfortunately not all of it. And I predicted exactly what was going to happen. I said, look, I don't really want to have a conversation with him because this and this is going to happen. But if you want, I'll have a short, conversation, but then, be aware that he's going to appeal to you as the mod or whatever the case. And of course, all of this exactly the way I predicted happened. And then he eventually rage quit because, Andrew, who was the mod, who was kind of my co-model that was early on in the thing, wasn't prepared to, do the Darth Dawkins bidding of dealing with me or whatever the case was in a way that he wanted to, which he's used to now. He's now got authority. In the old Google Hangout days, he couldn't do that. There was no way to have that authority. But with Discord, and particularly with Clubhouse, if you're a moderator or you have some admin privileges, then you can control the dialectic and who you speak to and how you deal with them and get rid of them and so on. So he's become he's now even less of a person who's got the time to want to deal with all of this. So we could do a whole show on how he sort of behaves and so forth. But suffice to say that, I'm not that interested in him, and I wouldn't particularly deal with him, to be honest.
No, I wouldn't go near a room that he was in, to be honest. It's the same clown show, I think, every time with him. So, right, Rob, we've been running an hour and 40 minutes already, which is...
Yeah, I've got something to do, unfortunately, this weekend. So I think if it's okay with you, I think we'll bring it to a close. I could chat to you for ages. It's been a pleasure speaking to you again as well, and listening to a few people in the comments. But I have got work to do this weekend. I've still got to prepare some things. So I think, as much as I've loved it,
it's been great, and I really appreciate the time you've given. I'm sure this will get many more views. Unfortunately, my audience is quite diffuse. We've got people in India, we've got people in Australia, North America, Europe. So there might not have been that many people listening live, but I'm sure there'll be plenty more views later on when the various time zones get into a good position. So, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on, Rob. It's been a great chat, and thank you for all the comments in the live chat. Go check out Rob on Clubhouse, and maybe at some point Rob will come back on the channel and we can do a bit more of this. And Rob, any last words?
No, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thanks to everybody who's listened live, and if you're listening to this as a recording, I'm always happy to chat to you. Come and find me under Rob Speakers in Clubhouse. I've got the same icon. I still use the Gin and Tonic icon there. It's just quite noticeable, so you'll know when I'm in a room or speaking to people. You'll be able to recognize me. And as I say, a pleasure chatting to you again, Drastic, and all the best for your channel and, of course, for the Gin and Tonic Show, and who knows what the future holds.
Cheers, Rob. Thanks, everyone, and I'll say good night.